Hi, welcome to Watercolour for Absolute Beginners. Here's just a rundown of the class that you've done. This class won't take 2 hours like the normal class because I'll just be running through and demonstrating all the exercises that we did, the 9 exercises on our worksheet. So it'll probably take about an hour, I'd say, maybe a bit less. You can stop and start the video as you choose. So I'm just going to go at my normal speed for painting, and you can rewind, fast forward, do whatever you like. So first of all, the kit that I sent people usually is tubed watercolor. I'm going to mix my colors on a palette. Choose something white. This one's a bit stained, but it's essentially a white palette because watercolor is transparent, it will distort the colors if you use a black plate or a red plate. That will come through the watercolor and you won't really be able to truly see your colors. So I've got my tube here of blue. I'm going to just put a little blob there about the size of a pea. It's important with this watercolor to just water it down. I'm putting a couple of drops here from my clean jar of water, like so. And what I want to do, what I'm trying to achieve here, is just get rid of any lumps of pigment suspended in the water, because I don't want lumps of pigment on my painting. So I'm just mixing. It's quite dark. I want it to be quite dark. And I'm just... when I'm satisfied, I want it to be quite dark. I don't want it to be too diluted. The more water I put in, the lighter my blue. So mixing from the tube is just a matter of getting rid of the lumps and making sure that it's thoroughly mixed. If I put more water in, I'd have a lighter blue, but I want to keep this blue fairly dark. Remembering again to have 2 jars of water, first one for dirty, second one for clean water. And I get my jar like so, and then I wipe it off on a tissue like so. And when I'm satisfied that all the pigment is out of the brush, because any little bits of pigment will just spoil a painting if you paint, the pigment will be there. Then I clean in my clean water jar and I'm ready to paint. So we're going to do 9 exercises on our paper. The first couple will be washes. I'm just got a bit of dust there, get rid of it. And we're going to do a wet on wet. That means the paper's wet and our paint is wet. Fairly self-explanatory. I'm going to get some clean water to start and just put it here onto my first rectangle. Just spread the water out. You can't see it on camera, obviously, because it's water, see-through. But if you look to the side when you're doing this, you can see a little sheen of wet. You don't want big puddles. You don't want to leave gaps. You want it thoroughly wet, like so. But just shiny wet, not puddles, because too much water may cause you problems. So my paper's wet here in my first square, and I'm going to do my wet on wet wash here. It's a flat wash. I want the blue to be absolutely even right across that space. I don't want it going from dark to light or light to dark or be streaky. I just want it to be a nice, what we call a flat wash. So I'm going to get my brush and I'm loading it up. And when I say loading it up, I don't mean I just dip a little bit of my brush in. I get my brush and I twirl it around and I gather up as much of that pigment as I can get onto the brush. This will give me a smoother result if I've got a well-loaded brush. And I go to the top left-hand corner. I'm only going to move my brush horizontally. I'm not going to go in all kinds of directions, up and down and vertically. And I just run it across. And you can see already that pigment will start to run in the water, which is what I want. And I see these are what we call beads. Where there's a buildup of the pigment, that's a bead. And I'm going to pull that back across and across again and across again. And what I don't want with this picture is to do this too hard. I want to be very soft with the brush. I don't want to damage the paper. I'll put a bit more pigment at the top there. I haven't got quite as much as I'd like. So there you can see a nice big bead of pigment, and I'm just going to start pulling that down into the water. Now, one thing you can do with watercolor washes is also to use gravity. So I'm going to start putting this on an angle. This is a good reason to stick your paper on a board because it's a bit easier to handle. And it also helps stop helps stop your paper buckling as it gets wet. But in kind of doing these kind of quick exercise, we don't really worry about that. So you can see I'm finding little beads of pigment, pulling them down into the water. And one of the lessons we'll certainly learn in this first Watercolour for Beginners class is that pigment follows water. And here we go with our pigment. I'm pulling down those beads. You can see I'm pulling down a bead there, picking it up, pulling it down, bit more, bit more, bit more, bit more. And you can see I just put a tiny bit more at the top there, pulling it down again through the liquid, pulling down those beads. You can see it's going across. It's quite hot today, so my paper's drying fairly quickly. So it's a little bit streaky at the moment, more streaky than I'd like, but I'm going to keep pulling down that pigment. You can see I'm building up, getting that bead there, pushing it across and pulling it down through into the water. I want that pigment to spread evenly through the water that's already laid down on the paper. And I'm getting to the end. It's just a little bit drier than I would have liked. I should have worked a bit faster, not talk so much. Looking a little bit streaky, but what will happen is the pigment will still follow the water and it should still keep spreading down a little bit. I might try pulling down a little bit more. I want to get rid of that streak down the bottom in the bottom third where the water just dried a little bit early. A lot of watercolour is just getting your timing right, trying to work fast because things dry out really quickly. And once your paint and paper has dried out, you can't work the paint anymore. Cleaning my brush again, I clean my brush constantly between everything, even if I know I'm going to be using the same colour. This flat wash is a little bit streaky, so I'm not 100% happy with that, but it will probably even out a little bit more. I can keep putting it on an angle with gravity, but I think we'll leave it there. It should spread a little bit more. Often with watercolour, the process of watercolour is staining water with a pigment and then in turn staining paper. So until everything is evaporated and everything is settled, you don't quite know how your watercolour is going to turn out. So this is still damp, it's still moving, even though I can't see it with the naked eye. So hopefully in about half an hour, perhaps that little streak will disappear. If I try and work it too much when it's dried to this degree, I'm going to have a few problems. So I'm just going to leave it like that. If I put too much water in here, I'll just show you. If I get some water and drop it onto a painting like so, if I have too much water to pigment, you can see these blooms forming where the water pushes out the pigments and makes this kind of cauliflower kind of shape. These are called blooms. These are okay if you are intentionally wanting blooms. So I've seen some beautiful watercolors where it's raining and the blooms are coming down from the sky under the clouds and it actually looks like a storm brewing. But if it's by accident, it's a bit of a disaster. So as you progress with watercolour and practice more and more, you'll get more of an instinctive sense of how much water to pigment ratio to have. And when you've used too much water, this bloom has appeared fairly quickly, but sometimes, as I said, it takes a while for the pigments and water to settle. That might appear, if you've got too much water, more gradually, and maybe in an hour or two, a bloom will appear. So sometimes you can do this beautiful painting, lots of water, dabbling it about, looks fabulous, but when it dries, it's covered in blooms. Just be aware of those. This is a wet on wet, so we can put another colour in here. I'm going to get my purple this time. And again, the same process. Let's just open up this purple. Same process, about a pea shape. Don't put too much pigment on your palette because you'll just have too much paint and nothing and nowhere to put it. So you just want to do a little bit at a time. If you're doing a huge project and you know that it's going to be huge, then obviously mix a whole lot. You can mix a whole jar full of pigment if you know you're doing something very, very big and you want to cover lots of area, but we're just covering little areas, so that would be ridiculous. So I'm just going to dab with some colour in here, clean out my brush, wipe it clean, get rid of that pigment. You can see how much pigment's in there. So I'm always cleaning out my brush, clean with clean water. I can drop a bit of that purple, spread it around a bit, maybe a bit more purple. And the reason I'm doing this is wet on wet is perfect for very soft transitions and billowy effects. I'll put a little bit of yellow in there, just because it's a bit contrasting. A little bit of yellow here. Yellow moves very slowly in water, generally. Pigments move at different speeds according to how heavy the pigment is. So if you've got a yellow, it's often quite heavy, and it will move slower than other colours. So I'm just going to put some blobs in there and let that just mix around. And as I said, once it all settles, the water evaporates and the pigment is left, you get some really beautiful, quite soft effects. Here's a picture I did earlier today. I've got the sky, which I've done with wet on wet. The only way you can get that effect is by using wet on wet, and again at the bottom. And when that wash has dried, I've left that little bit just plain. I haven't painted there, that white streak. Then I've just painted some dark green foliage in there, and it's a kind of stormy, abstract-y kind of landscape. So that's a typical use of a wet on wet wash. So I'm just going to let that dry as I work on to my next wash, which is a wet on dry. So this time paint is wet, again another blob. Paint is wet, but the paper is dry. This gives me much more control than a wet on wet. It doesn't make billowy patterns like this. And it's great for things like a gradient wash. So this wash, what I want to happen, I'm just putting the minimum amount of water I can in this one. It's a little bit thicker than that blue I had there. Just maybe you could mistake it for a bit thick like blood, a bit more thick than a cup of tea. And this time the paper is dry. I just dropped some water over here. Very important, if you do drop drops of water onto your surface, that you get rid of them, because they will have an effect on your piece. If you have water drops, the pigment will find those drops and spread into them. So this next one is wet on dry, and I'm now, same as before, going to my left hand corner and just pulling that pigment across. Now this time you can see it sits where it is, it doesn't spread any further, there's no water to follow. I wash out my brush, I get a little bit of tissue, wash out my brush, and I want to make sure it's nice and clean. Keep washing in that dirty jar like so. You can see the pigment every time I dip it in. I start to get rid of a bit of pigment, like so, and like so. And once I feel confident it's nice and clean, put it in the clean water, and now it's nice and wet. I put some water on my brush. I'm working a bit slowly here. This will get a bit streaky. And I just tease the pigment. I just get my brush and touch. It's already dried out there. Just touch the edge of that pigment with water. Clean out my brush, wipe it off, get clean water, and add a bit more water here. And you can see wherever the water is, that pigment will slowly start to follow. So you can see that's what's happening here. It's quite a nice effect, but I want it to be a bit smoother than that. And later we'll be doing what we call blending, which is really this technique but put into shapes, circles, petals, whatever shape you like. So I'm just going down here. I want to have a bit more water here. I want it to be quite pale. I'm letting that pigment be carried down, not just by my brush, but also by gravity. And you can see I'm just going back up to the top here, smoothing it out. I want it to be a little bit smoother than it has been, and I don't want it to be streaky, so I'm going backwards and forwards. Now what you can see here, you can see the pigment is starting to run into the water down to the bottom and starting to gather. I'm going to put a bit more water in there, and I'm going to let that happen, because what I'm going to do, I'm not going to let it bloom, but I am going to lift it off with a bit of tissue at the bottom, because I don't want it to be too dark. So any excess pigment and water that's formed, I just dab up with my brush, and I put a bit more water on and start again, because I want it to be a little bit lighter at the bottom there. So just smoothing that out again with my brush, acting like it's a feather. I want it to be very, very gently touching that paper. I don't want to scratch the paper, because if I scratch the paper, it will start gathering the pigment in the scratches, and my picture won't work very well. I'll just get scratched paper, and you'll see the cuts and scratches. So here, a little bit of water's gathered too much here. I can just get my tissue, just a little point of it, just soak up anything excess if I feel it's getting a little bit crazy and too much water. Like so, so just take that up, and because it's still damp, that pigment will still start going into there. So we've done 2 washes here, wet on wet because we want soft billowy sort of feel, wet on dry where we want something with a little bit more control. When we're colouring something in, when we're shaping something, this could be a cylinder and I want it to be dark at one side and become light in the middle and dark at the other side. You can you don't have to go from dark to light. You could leave the centre unpainted, do dark on both sides and bring them right up to the middle. So you've got dark to light, back to dark. But in this case, this is a gradient wash, just from dark to light. So that's what we use a wet on dry with, just where you want a little bit more control and we can move that pigment around. But with wet on wet, I won't know how this will look until about another hour or 2 at least, maybe sometimes 24 hours. So the next exercise we'll do, I'm going to call this one the mechanics of watercolour, just to show you how watercolour works. I just briefly before talked about how pigment follows water. Here's a demonstration. I'm going to put the letter H and the letter O. Of course, I've done it in water. You can't see it. I'm going to get some of my pigment, some of the purple, and all I do is just tap where it's wet, and you can see immediately the pigment starts to spread, but it doesn't spread beyond the boundaries of the water. And this is really important in watercolour. You can lay down your water first and then add pigment, or you have to watch out for it. It can cause you problems. So you can see here, I'm just letting the pigment flow. I haven't really painted very much. I can just touch the water with some pigment, like so. This is a very useful technique if you want to do what I call cheats calligraphy. You don't have to be a great calligrapher. You can write your message in water, tap with some colours, have a beautiful rainbow coloured message, good for a birthday card, good for something quick. So that's the mechanics of watercolour. Pigment will always follow the water, and you can see I've dropped some water here and made a couple of blooms. I'm going to try and get rid of them, but you can see it's quite difficult once a bloom's formed. If everything's a bit dry, which this is, it can be very difficult to get rid of. So good to avoid blooms if you can. I managed to drop a bit of water on there. I'm just going to try and even it out. Sometimes it will work, sometimes it won't. And I can't tip it too much because it's going to affect what I've painted here. So next, there's a bit of drop of water again. There is a lot of dropping of water. If I had a bigger space, I'd have my jars to the right of me, but because I'm in a very small space and filming, it's a bit hard for me to spread out. So often I drop drops of paint on my work when I'm teaching, which is a little bit irritating, but there it is. So that's the mechanics of the watercolour. Pigment will always follow water. It won't leave the boundaries, unless of course I bump it, of the water. So this can be a very useful thing to make use of. Where it becomes problematic is, say this was a flower, and I'll get a bit of green, and I was deciding to paint a leaf next to my flower. If I'm not patient and it's not quite dry, and sometimes it can be a bit unpredictable, it only has to be damp. I don't mean absolutely soaking. It's just a little bit damp. The pigment will find that damp, that water, and it will chase into it. So you can really ruin a picture. And here I go, this is a bit dried out, this green. But again, pea size, clean water, mix up the pigment so it's not lumpy into a sort of like an ink almost. It becomes almost like an ink if I want to keep the colours nice and strong. And I've just got my green paint mixed up there, and I'm going to draw a leaf. And perhaps you could imagine that I've just painted a rose and it's taken me many hours really carefully, and I'm doing the leaves that are next to it, and uh-oh, I just touched that red. Oh no, and my leaf, oh dear. So the red and the green will start to mix. I'll do another one over here. So I'm just doing my leaf. Uh-oh, there we go, completely ruined. I tried not to touch the red with the leaf. No, not really, because I'm demonstrating what happens. But you can see very quickly the pigment follows the water. Wherever it's wet, that pigment will start traveling. And my rose will be green and my leaves will be full of red. So I've kind of ruined my picture of roses. So What we often do because of this in watercolour is we plan out our pictures beforehand. So if we're doing a bunch of roses with some leaves with them, we paint all the red of the roses first, let them dry completely. If you can be really patient, wait a day or so and then paint your leaves. And then we paint the green, and there's less likelihood of two colours mixing, or the water and the pigment mixing. So we often work with doing each layer of colour one at a time. It's not like acrylic paint where it sits where you put it. You can paint what you like and put that paint next to the other paint. The pigment will follow the water. So with watercolour, often we paint in stages or in layers of colour. So that's the mechanics of watercolour. Here's another variation on that. I'm just going to get a bit of clean water. You can see here my clean water is getting a bit dirty, so I might just get rid of it or just get myself some more clean water. Here we go. Put another jar here. I'm going to put a little bit of water in there, so I've always got nice clean water and I don't muddy up my colours and mix them by accident. So the next one, with clean water, we're going to do, we're going to make some planets, I call them. Just make a circle of water like this. Go slowly so you can see it's just a circle. You can't see it again because it's water. So it's see-through, so you can't see it on camera. Of course, if I put my head to the side, it's a bit shiny. So I'm just getting some round, what I call planets. When you finish these, you can put black pen around it, Sharpie pen that is waterproof, and you've got a black sky and planets. That's how they look. That's how I like to think of them. So I'm going to get a bit of pigment and just drop it in. I'm not going to manipulate it anyway, and you can see it's starting to spread through the water. I'm going to get some purple now. And what you'll see when you drop these pigments in is they start to fight each other and wrestle each other for dominance. So different colours move at different speeds, different colours have different weights, some colours dominate more than others. So the more you practice painting and try different brands and different paints, the more you'll understand their physical qualities. So I'm just going to dab some green in there, clean out my brush. And let's try a bit of blue with this one, with the green, like so. Yellow is a bit sluggish, so I'm going to put a bit of yellow in here. And you can see it doesn't move quite as fast as the others, so you can help it along a little bit. Don't go crazy. Might put a bit of red in that yellow. And here's my last planet, just some dabs of red, some dabs of blue, dab of green, just to finish off with some green in that one too. And what I'm going to do with this is just leave it. Now, when you paint one of these, just try and take a mental photograph of it. Try and predict how you think it's going to look. And I can guarantee just about 100% that you'll never know how these will look. And it's a bit of a demonstration of how unpredictable watercolour is. How you can never quite tell what it's going to be until it's dry. It's also a demonstration of different pigments and their weights and how they vie against each other, how they mix, how they do different things. So I would suggest every time you get a new set of watercolours, do some planets. You'll understand a little bit more about the quality of the different pigments that you've got, because every brand, every type of colour is always different. I'm not very happy with this dark to light gradient wash because I did those blooms and tried to even them out. You can see I've just damaged the paper a little bit here, which means it's a bit streaky. That's not how it should be. But since you've done the class, you know that. So let's move on to the next one. But just something to point out that if you make mistakes in watercolour, it can be a bit difficult to fix them. Some mistakes are easy, some mistakes not so easy. I'm now going to do wax resist here. You can use masking fluid. You can buy it in small 100 ml bottles. Costs about $20 a little bottle, and you can paint out little parts of your painting that you want to remain white, because we don't use white in watercolour. We use the paper as white. So if I was doing an eyeball, for instance, I would leave the whites of the eyes unpainted, and that would provide white. Even though every watercolour set has white in it, we actually don't use it. White translucent watercolour is as good as useless. It doesn't do anything much. If we want to dilute a colour, make a pink or a blue or something lighter, we just add more water, and the paper underneath because the watercolor paint is translucent, shines through, reflects through. So I'm going to do a heart here with my wax Crayola crayon. You could use a Chinograph pencil. You could also use a candle, a white candle. I'm pressing as hard as I can because I really want to get a lot of wax off here. Very hot days, the paint can, the camera's shaking there, sorry. The paint can, the wax can melt into the paper and it doesn't work as well. So if it's a very, very hot day, probably not a great technique for this. But I'm just blowing off the excess wax. I'm going to get a little bit more water in my blue that's starting to run out, so it'll be a bit lighter than it has been, like so. And I'm just going to get my brush, and you can see where that wax is, the paper remains white. Now this is really useful if you want to keep an area white and you're not confident you cannot bump into that area. Use a little bit of wax, and you can put glints on a glass, for instance, where you want the glass to remain absolutely white, very thin slithers. A field of daisies, the petals can all be filled in with white, with masking liquid or little bits of Chinograph pencil. And when you come to paint the grass and the leaves around those daisy petals, it will remain white. So that's how we use masking and wax resist. It can be really useful if you're doing a little abstract. This one's quite nice. You don't have to just protect white. Here I protected pink and some of the colors underneath, and it's given me quite a nice little abstract effect. So, as I said, if this was dry, it's almost dry. If I want to protect another part of my painting, say I'm doing a landscape and I want to protect the hills I've just painted, I can put some wax over the top, and I'll pick another color. How about green? Because that doesn't, it's quite different to red. And I can just protect that bit of pinky red that I've laid down, and I can just glaze over this with some green. But where the wax is, I've protected. So you're not just protecting white, you can protect different colors in your painting. And as with this one, this is lots of layers of wax covering different bits of the painting. Of course, if you put wax onto the paper like this, you'll never get it off. So whatever decision you make when you're laying down the wax, that's what you've got to live with in the painting. You can't change it. Once you put the wax on the paper, that's it. You can't get it out. So that's wax resist. The next one we're going to do here is some blending. I'm going to look just here for a pencil. Here we go, here's a pencil. I'll use a pencil first. I normally don't draw out things with a pencil, and I'll tell you why, but I'll show it just with a demonstration so you can see. Here's a pencil shape of a petal, pretending it's a flower. Now, the thing with a pencil that happens is once I paint my pencil, so here's my guide for my petal, I get some 100%, or my red off my palette, as dark as it is, as dark as I can get it. And just put a little triangle at the bottom here. This is really a bit like when we did the wet on dry. We're wanting to have a bit of control with this. So I put down some dark pigment. I clean out my brush, so it's nice and clean. I might get a little bit of water, but take a little bit of excess off. I just want a little bit of water here. And I just start to pull out that pigment along my petal, like so. And I'm staying within the boundaries as much as I can of my pencil mark there. And I'm just pulling out that colour with a little bit of water. And as we know from this experiment, pigment follows water. So when I put a bit of water there, that pigment will start to follow. I want it to smooth out. I don't want to see a line. So I just brush very gently, like a feather touch, with my brush. And I might want to smooth that out a bit more too, and clean out my brush. This time I'm going to wipe off my brush. That's almost dry. It's damp, but there's no water on it. And again, I'm just going to very lightly, almost sort of stroking the pigment there. And you can see wherever the pigment touches my brush, it will come up again. And you can see what I'm doing here is I'm shading. I'm going from dark down the bottom there with my little petal, and just going to light. Now, I used a pencil for the outline here, and you might say to yourself, okay, I can rub that out now. I've done the petal. But once you put watercolour on top of pencil, ordinary lead pencil, it's varnished into the paper. You can't get rid of it. So that's one of the reasons watercolour artists and watercolours, you'll often note, don't use a pencil. They don't want their guidelines to be seen underneath. Sometimes they do. Sometimes part of the design is keeping the pencil marks in there. But that's often why a lot of watercolour artists practice and practice and practice by laying down the colour and not bothering with drawing underneath, unless they want those pencil marks to be shown. But I will show you a trick later with watercolour pencils, so you can kind of get around that. So there's my petal there and blended. Oh, before I do that, I might just put another colour in there just because it makes it a bit more interesting. I'm going to get a little bit of purple for this while it's still wet, and just put a little bit of purple down the bottom there because I want it to be kind of a richer kind of blend. And I'm just going to blend that purple in with that darker colour there. Wash out my brush, keep it clean, get rid of excess water on a bit of tissue so it's damp brush but not wet. And I can just very carefully blend very softly like so. Just keep blending. I've pulled up a bit too much pigment there, so I'm just going to get a little bit of water. And I, of course, don't want to put too much water on because it will bloom, which I don't want. So there's my petal, but it's got a pencil mark. This time I'll do my petal without a pencil mark. So this time I get my red. As before, I do just a little triangle like I did before, like so. Wash out my brush, make sure it's nice and clean. So there we go. Make sure there's no pigment. You see a little bit of red pigment just came off there. That would be not what I want to touch the paper. So you can see it's now nice and clean, no more pigment coming out. Get a little bit of water, not too much, and just start to pull out that pigment like so, just blending that pigment. Oh, it's a little bit wider here perhaps. And washing out the brush again. Tedious as it is, that's what we do all the time. We're always making sure our brushes are nice and clean. Get a little bit of water and again pull out that pigment. Very similar to the wet on dry technique, except now we're not doing it in a square, we're doing it on an object. So just mixing through that pigment like so, blending it. You can see it going from dark to light and to the top of that petal, just brushing where, so I don't have a line forming, like so. And there's my petal, this time without the pencil mark. Whoops, and I just, by accident, pulled some pigment up there. And I just very gently get rid of that. Of course, you can also push pigment away. I can actually push some of that pigment down here. And again, I'll put a little bit of purple at the bottom there, just a little bit of visual interest, just so it's not just pink. A little bit of purple down the bottom there. And because it's wet, it will spread into the pigment. All I need to do is put a little bit of water there, like so, spread it up. And I can let that sit and blend, or I can just take up a little bit of the excess. There's quite a bit of water there, so I don't want it to be blooming. So I just take up the excess water, like so. Get my brush and just very gently tease up that pigment, like so, into there. And you would use blending for things like shading, giving volume to an object. With a little bit of red down there again, because I've kind of got rid of all the pigment, like so. And you would use it to create volume in an object, create shading in a picture. So that's how we use blending, and they're the ways we would use blending. So you can, my brush is sort of dividing into two there for some reason. Sometimes you need to push your brush back into a point, and that's what I'm just doing there. So there we go. I feel it's a little bit too dark pink there. All I need to do is get a little bit of clean tissue, and again I can lift off a little bit there just to lighten it up a little bit. So you can see that it's not the smoothest of blending, but blending, just keep practicing and practicing. One thing to say about pigments is the more expensive a pigment you had, if I had a Winsor & Newton pigment I was using there, the transitions are much smoother. The pigment moves more easily. Cheaper pigments tend to sit a bit longer and a bit harder to manipulate. So, you know, the more expensive the pigment you get, the better you can get your blending to work, the smoother. But for as we're learning, it's absolutely fine. I'll also do a leaf. There's another thing that we did in the class was a leaf. I'll do a green leaf. I've got my green, has a bit of yellow in it. And I'm just going to do a very generic, basic leaf shape like so. Just laying down a wash, using the tip of my brush and a little stalk on that leaf. And I was showing you in the class that you don't have to just paint. You can also scratch, paint with a brush. You can scratch in with the bottom of the brush. So I'm just scratching in some thin lines, which I could never paint that thinly. Another thing to say is if I painted in these lines on this wet paint, it would just go wet on wet and blur everywhere and I wouldn't have lines. But what happens when I scratch into the paper, where the paper is damaged, so to speak, the pigment will fall in the grooves. That's why we don't want to damage our paper. Pigment will fall into any imperfections in the paper, any scratches, but we can use that to make straight lines if we want, draw shapes into things, good for animal hair, good for grass in a landscape. And you can see already that the pigment is falling in there into those grooves. And I can put another color on there just to also highlight those grooves. I'm putting a blue wash over the top of this green now, and the blue will fall into those grooves. You can see it slowly. I'll lift it up to the camera. You can see it starting to fall into those grooves. So very useful if you want to draw details onto your picture, etch some lines into a scene. Before we go on to the next exercise, just pointing out your planets, if you're doing them along with me, you can see how they mix together. They're quite different. I couldn't imagine how it would work out. This one's got some beautiful little sort of spidery, almost like if you're looking at an aerial shot of rivers. So it's quite beautiful and quite unpredictable, and shows you how pigments sort of fight against each other and fight for dominance in a puddle of water. So our next one is glazing, and I'm just going to get some yellow for the glazing. I'll put a bit more yellow there, running out of yellow. Another blob of yellow, some clean water, and just going to mix up that yellow, get rid of the blobs. And with glazing, glazing is basically putting one color on top of the other, which is a way of mixing color on the paper, not in the palette. So instead of mixing green here, I'm mixing nothing on the palette, I'm mixing it on the paper. So I put my yellow down first, and I'm going to do some vertical lines like this. It must be dry. If it's wet, I just get a wet on wet effect. Glazing is waiting for one layer to dry and then glazing another color over the top. So once this is dry, I'm going to move on to the next two exercises. Once this is dry, then once I put blue on top of there, I will have blue lines going across horizontally and yellow lines, and where those two colors intersect, I should have a sort of a green, because all these colors, all these watercolor colors are translucent. The paper is shining through. We don't really quite notice that, but the paper is shining through, giving it a kind of lumosity that other paints don't have. They're kind of opaque and sit on top of paper. So the paper reflects through the colors, and also that yellow will come through blue when I put blue down there, but I can't put it on yet because it's still wet. So we'll demonstrate that after. We use glazing doing landscapes. If we've decided a color, perhaps my hills are, I want a purple haze in the distance, I might have painted my hills green. I can put a layer of purple on the top of that green. The green will still slightly come through, but the purple will be laid on top, and the two colors will complement each other and mix on the paper. I don't mean blend on the paper, I mean create a third color through layers, if that makes sense. The next one we're going to do is with our straw. We're going to do our cherry tree. So again, in the kit, you should have some brown. If you don't have any brown handy, you could always mix red and green. You'll get a nice brown. But I'm just going to put a bit of brown in here. Starting to dry out this one. Always remember to put your lids back on. I didn't with this one, and they do dry out really quickly. That's the downside. Oh, just squirted on my hand. Luckily not on my face. I wouldn't have been happy. So I'm going to get my brown. It's about the size of a pea. Put it into here. Wipe off where it squirted at me. So that's the reason to remember to put on your lids. There's not much left in this little tube, so I'm happy about that. They do dry out. Oh, I'm going to just drop some more water on there. They do dry out in the tubes if you leave the lid off, and then it's really hard to get the colours out because they're usually in a metal little tube. But once they're dried on the inside, very hard to get them out. You can, of course, still use that paint. It will reactivate with water, but just hard to get out of the tubes once you've done that. I'm going to use my dirty water with my brown because I want this to be quite dark. So there's my brown. I want it to be darker than this. So I'm going to put some purple in it. If you put a bit of purple into a brown, it will deepen the colour, which is what we want. I'm happy to use dirty water in this one. I want it to be fairly runny, but I still want it to be dark. You can use black if you have any. There should be some in the kit. If you want to use a little bit of black just to deepen it, you can do that. But watercolour artists are often very snooty about black. And we don't tend to use it all that much in a watercolour. So I'm just going to get my black there, or my dark brown there. It's quite a dark brown. What I want to mimic is a cherry tree colour. And I put a little blob, a droplet of that coloured water and pigment at the bottom here. See where I'm pointing? And put my brush aside. And I'm going to use my straw. The point of this exercise is whatever way you can make a mark on paper, just do it. You don't have to use a brush. You can use a twig. Some artists actually do paint with some twigs to get interesting lines. You can paint with a sponge. You can paint with a toothbrush. And in this case, we're just going to blow the pigment around the page because it gives us a really nice spidery kind of line. It's a little bit like trees in the winter when the leaves have gone. So it's a really nice basis for a tree trunk, which is what we're going to do. So I've got my brush, it's not a brush at all, is it? It's a straw, and I'm going to blow, and I'm trying to blow straight up ahead. I want my branch to go that way. Of course, I'm blowing. It's a bit unpredictable. It could go anywhere. So it's always a little bit of hit and miss. Sometimes it works really well, sometimes not as well, but it's fun to do. So here I go. Quite happy with that. I got a nice straight up line. Very happy with that. I'm going to get some more brown now on my brush and just load up the brush. And because of my experience before, I know that if I just tap very gently where that paint is, wherever it's wet, whoops, it's a bit hard to get there, but if I'm careful enough, I can. If wherever the paint is, it will sit only in that water channel. It won't go anywhere past the borders where it's wet. I learnt that from this exercise, that you can tap that and the pigment won't leave where it's wet. Same with this, just tap a little bit of pigment onto your branches and it won't go outside the line you've already created. So I'm just going to try and go this direction this time on a diagonal. Oops, and I didn't get anywhere, so I'll try down here. And it worked that time. Now, if it goes into the neighboring picture, just try and get it up before it does any damage and goes into the heart. I'll try going this way. I've still got quite a bit of liquid there, but I'll just put a little bit more liquid there, or more pigment and liquid. So I'm just going to blob in a bit more there, like so, and I'm going to try and make it go that way. And it worked great. And so I can keep moving the paper around. Well, it just doesn't want to move that pigment that way. So you can see when it goes onto the tape there, I'm just taking it up so I don't get brown paint everywhere. And now I'm just going to get my brown again. Whoops, and I just dropped something somewhere. I'm going to put it on here. Here it's a bit too, it's not obviously going to stay too much in that very thin line, but generally it's not going to move. And again, and oh, that's nice. That's what I wanted. And I'm going to try again here. I'm really determined to get the branch that goes that way from here, but for some reason it just doesn't want to blow that way. So I'll put a little bit more pigment there, and off we go. Let's try that again. Yes, I got a tiny one. No, it really doesn't want to go that direction, but that's okay. Now, once I've got enough branches, that's a bit spindly and thin, I can thicken it up a bit, especially down the bottom. Obviously, if I was going to make this into a big picture, say the paper went down here, I'd draw the rest of the trunk. But I can thicken up the trunk at this point here. It doesn't have to be, that's a bit watery there, but anyway. I can thicken up my trunk in parts. It doesn't have to be thin at the bottom. In fact, it looks more tree-like if I thicken it up a little bit. But I've got these lovely thin lines. I can paint some more twigs or leaves off it, but you never get quite the same line as if you blow it, which is why I blow it, because this kind of thin spidery line is very hard to get with a brush. I might just thicken here because trees don't quite look that way. And I might just pull up the trunk there. So when you're satisfied it looks like a tree, that looks like a tree in winter. The next thing that we'll do are some leaves. I'm just going to get a little bit of paper here. Move this aside, and leaves. It's good to practice them before you start laying them down on the real picture. This is a good exercise for brush control. The more you do this, the more you'll be in control of your brush, less mistakes. It's about the muscles in your hands, so good to practice this stuff. We want leaves to be small but fit the tree. So what we do to do leaves is we just use the very tip of the brush like so. And you can see it's almost like printing. There we go. I'm just going to do a little row of these like so. And I'm going to try and make them smaller and smaller as I go. So here's the biggest it will do if I press as hard as I can, not so pointy. And I'll try and just keep going smaller, smaller, smaller. And this will just give me a chance to practice my brush control. Again, going smaller, 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 so that when I come to my tree and I want it to be in scale with my tree, I've practiced and I've got used to the rhythm of this. I'm going in a straight line. That's not how leaves go. So I'm now going to practice moving my hand backwards and forwards and around, because leaves don't all grow in one direction. If you find this difficult, then just remember to move your paper around, and that will help you get leaves that go in different directions, because leaves don't grow all in one direction unless they're succulents. I suppose they do sometimes. So I'm just practicing my hand back to front. Some days is easier than others, but it's good to practice this so you just have much more flexibility in your brush work. So the other thing to say about leaves is they're never the same colour. They're also different colours. So I'm just going to get a little bit of a yellowy, oh, that's a bit more olivey. It's always got the same colour. So I might put a little bit more yellow in there and just give me a slightly different green to work with. So there we are. I'll put a bit more water in there. And you can see when I put this one down slightly lighter, and I can crisscross. If these were dry, it's probably better, but I'm just putting those little lighter leaves all around the place. And if you get enough of those, you kind of get the illusion of the sun coming through the leaves. If you've got different colors, some light, like so. So they're quite fun, and you can do quite beautiful. You can do that within a circle and have a kind of a pretty little tree. You see, like this, and if I just put a little trunk at the bottom there, this is a segue. I've got a tree, haven't I? Put some branches there. So, you can do some really nice little pictures, little rough cartoony pictures. So now I've done my leaves. I've practiced my brush stroke. I'm going to put that aside and do it on the real thing here. So, getting my brush. Woo! I just dropped again. And I'm just going to get the tip like I did and tip just around like so, like this. Getting my leaves in there, going in different directions. I'm starting to lose light here. It doesn't look so much on camera like I'm losing light, but the light's starting to go. I think there's a storm brewing outside. So just moving along. And you can see I'm just moving the light green here. I'll get some of the darker green. I'll mix it with a bit of blue, like so. And whoops, again, of course, it might be better practice to let that light green dry first, and then they won't run into each other. But I'd have to wait and let it dry, and I'm losing light, so I can't do that. So here I go. It's going around and around with the green. And again, it's a tasting. When you feel you've got enough leaves and you're happy with that, you can be ready to do either some little pink blossoms, or you could do apricots, or you could do plums, depending on what color you use. And you'd make, obviously, plums oval. You would make apples round, apricots round but orange. So I've got my little tree there. We're going to do, or I'm going to do, some little cherry blossoms is the idea. So back to my little scrap piece of paper here. What's great about watercolor is how many colors you've actually got in 10 tubes. Here we go. Here's my red. I'll just show you. I'm going to get a pink out of this. You don't have to buy a tube of pink paint if you've got red. This one is a crimson red, which will give me a nice pink, a really nice rosy pink. If I'd used a vermilion red, which has quite a bit of orange in it, crimson has a bit of blue in it, vermilion red has some orange in it. If I watered this down, I get a kind of Caucasian skin color. But if I water down crimson, I get a beautiful rose color, or an ice pink even. So I'm just going to put down my paint. Let's call this 100%. That's as red as I can get it, as strong a red as I can get. Like so. There's my first swatch. I'm going to wash out my brush and get some clean water, and just put that clean water there and get some red. And I'm going to do another swatch underneath it. This time I'm at about, I don't know, 70% of the same red. Keep adding water to that pink. And as I go down with my little swatches, it will get, the more water I add, the more I dilute it, the paler. Oh, it's gone quite pale there. And paler it will get. I keep adding some more water. And you can see I'm getting right down here, right down to quite a pale pink. And I'm going to go one more step here. And that's really what I would call an ice pink at the bottom. So just from that one tube of crimson, I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 shades from crimson right down to an ice pink. So within, if you've got 10 tubes of paint in your set, that means you've got 100 colors at least. And then don't forget, of course, you can also mix some more blue in, say, this pink. It's not just the shades of red. I can also use other colors to give me even more different shades. So probably in a set of 10 watercolors, you might have, I don't know, 1,000 colors. It's quite something. I'm going to put a bit of green into this pink and mix it together with the pink. And again, it's a, I don't know what color that is, but anyway, it's a greeny pink. So you can see so many different shades just from, that's from 2 colors, really, from 2 tubes there on my palette that's just sitting there. So if you've got a set of 10 watercolors, you've probably got 1,000 colors at your fingertips. That's always good to know, because it can seem very expensive, some of these materials, but you can get quite a lot of use out of them. So once I've got my pink and I'm happy with it, I'll just double check that pink. Oh yes, I like that pink. It's a nice shade. I'll put that aside, bring back my worksheet here. Again, looking back at my planets, that one's dry. That's pretty much set. We'll change a little bit more, but not much. This one's quite wet still, so quite some change still to come. I'm going to do, we held the brush like this to do leaves. This time we're going to hold the brush. I'm trying to hold it so you can see it on camera. Let's turn this upside down, might help a bit. This time I'm going to put it to right angles to the paper. So this time, this brush control technique is just doing some little circles, and I just twirl, put my brush at right angles to the paper, and twirl like so. Oops, that one went a bit awry, and this just gives me some little circles. So like so. The way you hold your brush will make different marks. The way, the angle that you've got it at the paper will make different marks. So just practicing using different parts of the brush itself will give you quite a bit of brush control. So there's my little tree, my little cherry blossom tree with some little blossoms in there. Hard to see on the camera, the pink, but it's there. The last one we're going to do, I'm just going to show you watercolor pencils in the last square. Here is a watercolor pencil. I've sent most of you who've got a kit watercolor pencils. If you haven't got any, I think they're a really useful tool. They're very good. They're not really a replacement for watercolor. I can't really get this kind of thing happening and richness of color, but they're great if you're traveling. Throw them in your handbag and you've got a set of watercolors so you can do something, make sketches. So here's my watercolor pencil. I've got this purple one here. I'm just going to draw a bit. It's an okay pencil. It feels a bit waxy when I draw with it. It's not like one of those beautiful Cumberland Derwent pencils that we used to all covet, you know, when we were kids at school. It's an okay pencil. I wouldn't think much of it. But as soon as I put a bit of water with it, I'll just put my brush down. Here we go. As soon as I put a bit of water on there, it dissolves. It's a watercolor in a pencil. I suppose that's what it's called, a watercolor pencil. That shouldn't be a surprise. You can also get crayons in watercolor pencil, and you can see as soon as I do that, I can dissolve that color, and I can get kind of a little bit pen and inky kind of effect. It doesn't look like a straight pencil. It does have a sort of watercolor effect. The other good thing about watercolor pencils is they're kind of inert. They don't move around as much. So if I wanted to draw some detail in here with my wet watercolor pencil, there we go. I've got just done some, takes a few moments to activate. That will stay there. If this was watercolor wet on wet and I was putting another color in there or drawing something, it would all become like a wet on wet wash. But watercolor, oops, I just snapped it there. Watercolor pencils can just kind of sit, still look like watercolor, look like you might have painted it, but they sit and they don't move around so much. So they're really good for drawing detail into a watercolor. They're really good also. I showed you before how pencil gets varnished into paper once you put some watercolor on the top. If you want to draw something, you're not confident in just painting it, say it's a rose, here we go, center of the rose, here are some petals. That's what I want my picture to look like. Not really, but there you go. I've got my picture there, that's my guide. If I'd done that in pencil, that will remain under my picture, but this way I can get a similar color, red, that's a bit brown with the ones I've used, and I can still have my guide to paint in, so I can paint absolutely in the borders of that watercolor pencil. And I can either keep pressing on it or brushing it, it will dissolve. I'll try and go for something a bit lighter. Or you can see I can leave a little bit there if I want it, but it means I can plan out and draw out objects or things that I want to paint without worrying about the pencil mark. So you can get a full set of watercolor pencils and you can use them if you're doing, you know, landscape with lots of different colors and different things. You can map it out with your watercolor pencils in the correct colors, and then when you come to putting that same color on top of the watercolor pencil, you can make it dissolve or keep it. You don't have this problem where the pencil mark remains. So that's how we use watercolor pencils. Very good for quick sketches, very good for a little travel, very good for mapping out pictures. I'm now going to go across here with some blue. Come back to this exercise, which is glazing, putting some blue wash over the yellow, like so, or blue lines over the yellow. I'm going to get some water here, just mix up a little bit of blue. I don't want to make it too dark because you won't see so easily, so I'm going to make it a fairly pale blue, just like the red making pink. I can make a pale blue by just adding lots and lots of water to my pigment. So here's my lines. I'm just going to, if I work it too much, or if this yellow is still wet, it's not glazing, it's blending or making a wet on wet kind of mark. I need this yellow to be dry, so really I should wait a couple of hours to do this, but anyway, this is glazing. I'm putting my blue across like so, and like so. And what will happen, I'll put a little bit of red on there too. Let's see how that goes, a bit of pink or red. Oh, I had a bit of purple on my brush there. So you can see where You won't see it yet, but as this dries, the yellow will start showing through the blue and through this pinky purpley red, and I'll get a third colour. So it's a way of mixing colours on paper. And as I said, you can colour big, so say I put a bit of green on top of this, or yellow on top of this blue. When that dries, the blue will still be showing through and you'll get a kind of green. So you can glaze different colours on top of each other and layer colours, and it really is a very effective look and technique. So I'm just going to move that aside. You can write down when you've finished your worksheet, you can write down what these things are. Take off the tape. Now, once you might, I just too fast. Once you take tape off paper, what you're left with is a nice clean line. So in a sense, we're masking, like we did with the wax, but masking with tape for a nice straight line, just like we do if we're painting a wall and using masking tape. And what that does is just provides a nice clean frame around our pictures. And as soon as you put a nice straight edge around something, it looks much better, doesn't it? So it's a form of framing. Here I went too far and I went too fast and tore the paper. Not much I can do about that. You can write in the different effects. So this one was wet on wet. This one was wet. Oops, I just put my finger on there. Wet on dry. This one is mechanics. This one is blending on its own. So I didn't touch any of that. It's just mixed how it's wanted to. This one is masking, and I used wax. This one is blending and scratching the leaf. You remember that one? Scratching. This one is, I have to go downwards here, glazing. This one is with a straw. And this one is a watercolour pencil. So there are all our different techniques. If you want to research further, you can put in these terms: wet on wet, wet on dry, blending. All these different terms are used commonly with watercolour talk. So you can look on the internet and Google them and find those techniques. And lastly, I'll just show you that peony again in case you missed it. Here's my paper. I'm using the 300 GSM heavier paper. I start a third of the way down. I want to have a bit more red. I'm just going to get rid of some of my very dirty water here and make sure I've got some nice clean water for this, because I want the red to really be punched out red. Don't want it to have bits of brown and purple in it. Cleaning off my brush into the clean, and here you can see is my toilet roll. There's a little bit of pigment there, but not much. So I clean that off. And as I said, I'm going to start a third of the way down because I want to have enough space, be guaranteed enough space when I get to the bottom to put in my leaves. I'm going to get some of my crimson. Mix a bit more. I need a bit more crimson there. Going to put in some water. I want it to be very strong. This pigment, I want the center of my flower to be red. I don't want it to be wishy-washy. One other thing just to say quickly, when you do paint with watercolor, it does dry about 20 to 30% lighter. So if I thought this was a bit anemic looking and I wanted my red to be redder, once it's dry, has to be dry, I could do it here, I can put another layer of red in, and you can see where I put that red on there, it's much stronger. So often we layer up to about 3 or 4 times, depends on the quality of the paper. You can also layer the same color on top, layer upon layer, maybe up to 4 times, just to intensify colors. So I'll put a bit on here too. So I'll put a little bit of red here because I want it to be more red at the base. You may or not see that, but you can certainly see it here. Once I put another layer of red on, it gets darker. And if I want it even darker still, wait till that dries and then put another layer on. Just quickly showing you that. So here I am. I've already dropped water on this as usual. Get that up before I start. Don't want it to ruin the picture. As I said, starting a third of the way down, and I just do this, put a little bit more water in there. I just do the letter C like so with a nice thick loaded brush. So I've got plenty of pigment to play with. And now I'm going to use just plain water to pull out the pigment. And as we know from everything we've done today, where I touch that pigment, the pigment will follow the water. So here I go, just keep touching and pulling out every time. Whoops, every time I pull out, the pigment will follow the water. So more and more, and I've got to work fairly quickly with this. The quicker you work with this, the better, because it will dry out very quickly. So here I go, I'm putting more water down, going as fast as I can. Just the less you think about this, the better they turn out, I always find. And there we go. I'm just going to pull out that pigment like so. And again, with this bit, my other C going the other way, putting some water down there and pulling out that pigment. Every time I brush water there, what happens? The pigment follows the water. And I leave little white spaces there because I want the look that my flower has some light reflected on it, like so. And just keep pulling out, and I wiggle my edges of my petals because I want it to look like a flower that, you know, by the end of the day will be kind of wilting and dying. It's not something that's not, we're not painting those kind of folk art flowers are kind of heavy and wooden looking. We want something that's kind of light and gets lighter and lighter. Here in the center where those two C's met, I'm going to put a little bit more red in there, but keep a little bit of white, like so. Of course, I could have also used a bit of wax in there and masked it, but it's not that big a deal. Put a little bit of water in there just to kind of soften it, like so. And what you can see also is the pigment is beading around the edges. I'm just going to lift some of that off because I don't want that look. I want it to get lighter and lighter as it goes out. So you can see I'm just going to take up that edges of that flower, and you get the sense that it's getting lighter and just lighter as it goes out, like so. So there's my basic flower shape. This should fill the page. You shouldn't make a little mean flower in the corner. And likewise with the leaves, you want nice big leaves that match the size of the flower. So none of that tiny little leaf. Let's go for a nice big leaf. So the first thing I do before I do the leaf is I get a little bit of yellow. I could wait for this to dry if I want these to be more distinct, but I like these to be a little bit wet on wet kind of look. And I'm just putting in a little bit of yellow here, just putting a little bit of water in that yellow, smoothing it out. Smoothing out the pigment. It's got a little bit of pink still on my brush, but that's okay. And I'm just going to dab, again to right angles, where we dabbed before with our cherry blossom, same with this, just dab some little dollops of yellow, like so. And these are to suggest stamen and pollen. So I just put some little bit of that there. I want it to be kind of soft. I like it spreading out, but if you don't like it spreading out, you want it to be very distinct, then just wait till the red dries and then put the yellow on. Now, the other thing, I've got my watercolor pencil. I've got the dark blue one there. I'm going to dip it in water here so it's activated and a little bit watercolory. And I'm just going to do some little lines just to give me a hint. Keep dipping it in water. A little hint of, actually it's dark brown, that's not the dark blue at all. Just a hint of the stalks of the stamen, like so. Just a little bit of that. And then the other thing I do, which again is a taste thing, you may or may not like it, I do put a little bit of a hint just around the edges here of watercolor pencil, a little bit wet, just to sort of give me a little bit of a shape around the petals. Now, you may or may not like that, so you can leave that in or leave that out. And then the last thing I do is we're going to put in the green of the leaves. I've got some green here. I'm going to mix a bit of blue in there just so it goes a bit further, maybe a bit more yellow because I want it green there. So I've got some green with, I've just put all the things I've got here to make green. And I just put a little triangle, and this little triangle is the part where the flower joins the stalk. That's the idea of this little triangle. It's mixing with the pink. I can either decide to take that up, or I might like that wet on wetty kind of loose look, but I've chosen to take that up, and I'm just putting that little bit of green there. So I've got a little green triangle there. Then I put a line, which would be the stalk, And now I'm going to think about my leaves. As I said, don't do this. It doesn't look right. You need to have a nice, big, generous leaf. So classic leaf shape, one that way, one that way. That's big. And now I'm going to fill that in green, like so. But the thing, that's not a peony leaf. What I do next is I'm going to put some points on. So I get my brush, 1, 2, 3, and I put some little kind of points on the side, which look a bit more like peony leaves. So they've got a nice big generous leaf. We've got that tiny crazy little flipper leaf. We've got a leaf like that. And again, you could do your scratching technique here. If you want to have some veins on the leaf, that's again whether you like that look. I think it's good to have a little bit of texture on the leaf. It makes it look more like a leaf. And again, I'll do one more leaf on the other side. I've nearly run out of that green, so I'll just mix a bit more yellow and blue. There we go, like so, and here. And again, classic leaf shape to start. Curve one way, curve the other. Fill in the center, nothing fancy, just fill it in like so. And then it's a little bit light, but it doesn't matter. Little bits of the points, like so, on that leaf, like so. And again, I'm going to scratch that leaf just to put some little veins in there. And I know that the pigment will flow into those grooves, like so. So there we go, like that. And then, you know, I could put a little bit of blue on that leaf just to give it a bit more visual interest. Might mix a bit of purpley brown on there. I want to sort of enrich this leaf a bit. I don't want it to be just a flat kind of leaf. I want to have a little bit of stuff on it, you know, maybe even a little bit of red here and there. So the leaf has got some little insect bites or holes in it. Maybe we went overboard there, but you know, just a little bit of colour. And in a sense, what I'm painting here, it's almost a wet on wet because the green is already there and wet. I'm almost got a wet on wet effect with those leaves. Now, I should let that dry, but I just want to show you the other thing you can do. I'm going to get a little bit of blue because that blue's a bit contaminated with other colours. Get a little bit of blue, and you can also put a little rough wash around something like this. So adding some water, just get rid of the dirty water here. Adding a little bit of water to my blue. I want to have a little pale blue. Now, if I'm doing a pink flower, obviously blue, when I put it around this pink flower, it kind of makes the pink pop a bit more than a white background. It's what I call giving it a bit of context. I'm just going to mix some water in my blue. And again, I can get my little test sheet and just check the shade of blue. Too dark for what I want. So I'm just going to get a little bit here. That's more like it. So you can see, dilute that blue, get a nice pale blue going. There we go. So just mix that up there. A bit more water. And I can start putting a wash in. Now, of course, best practice would be to have left that all to dry, but I'm losing light, so I can't turn the camera on and off and let it dry. So I'm just going to paint it while it's wet and try not to touch the green. Of course, this is another way of practicing your brush skills, putting the paint exactly where you want it without touching things that you don't want to touch. That's practice. So you could do it just as a kind of practice thing anyway. Just putting in some more here and here. But the best thing to do would be to let the whole thing dry before I put on the background wash. But, you know, I'm not going to bother to do that. As I said, we're losing light, so we can't really do that. There might end up being a few little runs, but I'm not too worried about that. Just put a bit more water in there so it's still a nice blue. Of course, if this was a blue flower I painted, I wouldn't paint a blue background. What I want to do is make the picture pop. So if it was a blue flower, I'd put a pink background perhaps, or just at least a contrasting colour. That really helps just to make this little flower kind of stick out from the page. And there I go, going around like so. And down here. You might think, what is the next thing to do with watercolour? I've got a few more watercolour classes coming up where we just concentrate on doing washes and nothing but washes, beginners, absolute beginners washes. We just delve a bit more deeply in that and practice washes. I've also got one that is painting water droplets. That's a lot of fun, and that uses a lot of blending. So if you really want to get your head around blending, that's quite a nice little class to do. And of course, I would also suggest starting to go for walks and take photographs of things that catch your eye, clouds in the sky, scenery. I also myself collect old National Geographics and cut out landscapes and think, how can I translate what I'm seeing into watercolor? How could I paint the sky so it looks like this photograph? Or how can I paint the water so it looks like this photograph? So you'll find a lot of material in things like landscape material in National Geographics and in magazines. I also collect watercolor pictures I see in magazines like Frankie or whatever and think, how did they do that? How did they get that technique or that texture? So here's my peony. I also like to keep these old mats from pictures. Just in the op shop you'll find them, and you can just use them just to frame things up, have a look at how things look. Things always look different when they're framed. This one's a little bit small for this peony, but you kind of get the idea. Once you frame something, it kind of takes on a life of its own. Maybe if I go higher, you can do it visually. There we go, maybe. So you can see as soon as I start framing that up, it's quite nice, isn't it? Somebody might like that if I go to someone's house and say, oh, here's a picture of a peony. So there we go. That concludes watercolor for absolute beginners. As I said, I'm running through it quickly and you can stop and start the video. And by now you're at the end of the video, so I suppose that's redundant advice. Anyway, hope to see you again, and I hope you enjoyed watercolor for absolute beginners.